Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 6 for History 102. And as you remember, last time I spoke with you guys, I talked about all the events leading up to the Spanish-American War. And I believe we left off with President McKinley going in front of Congress on April 11th, 1898 to make his declaration of war speech. So, what's going to happen next in this war that is commonly referred to as, quote, a splendid little war? That term was coined by Secretary of State under McKinley, John Hay. Now, as we'll find out, as far as America is concerned, I suppose this was a splendid little war. As far as the Spanish were concerned, it was not. But we declare war in April, and we kind of get caught with our pants down. We don't really have a standing army of any extent, and most of the military that existed after the Civil War were troops that were out west fighting Native Americans. And as we know, that all came to a screeching halt with the massacre at Wounded Knee. And in that time period between 1890 and 1898, when the Spanish-American War begins, the military really had not expanded at all, with the exception of the Great White Fleet, which we talked about previously, which included the Maine that was sunk in Havana Harbor. So, we really have to get our act together quick. We declared war, and with the sort of idea that declare war now, prepare later. And remember, Cuba was occupied by 200,000 Spanish troops that had been sent over there. So we really had our work cut out for us, because when the War Department reports to President McKinley after the declaration of war speech, we have 28,000 men in our army. So McKinley makes a speech to the public, and he calls for what he needs is 125,000 volunteers as soon as possible to prepare for this war effort that we've already declared. And because of how riled up the public is over the Maine and being stoked more by the yellow journalism, McKinley is astounded that within 1 week, 1 million men volunteer. 125,000 volunteer from his home state of Ohio alone. So now we're in a situation where before we didn't have enough volunteers, now we got more than we know what to do with. So they weed through these volunteers, and they're going to end up with approximately 260,000 men in the United States Army and 25,000 sailors in our Navy. That's the force we're going to go up against the Spaniards in the Spanish-American War with. But there are still other problems we have to deal with, because we don't have the equipment for 260,000 soldiers. We have arsenals with old, out-of-date Civil War weapons stockpiled in them. In this war, by 1898, those weapons are useless. The weapon of the day for foot soldiers is Springfield rifles. So our arms manufacturers have to go on a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day schedule, producing as many of these arms as possible. In the meantime, we still have to train 260,000 men. The boot camps that exist for these men amount to sort of what a lot of people did when they were kids, playing army with wooden guns. They don't have Springfield rifles. They've got old Civil War muskets, and there's no sense in training any soldiers with a musket. So they use wooden dummy guns and basically play war until the weapons are prepared. Also, we lack uniforms. We have plenty of wool uniforms stockpiled from the Civil War, which obviously aren't going to be ideal for fighting in Cuba. So we really have our work cut out for us. And one thing that I want to talk to you about next involves how the very first battle of the Spanish-American War, which happened on May 1st, pretty quickly after the declaration of war, and this very first battle happened in the Philippines. But there's some background information behind how this all occurred. Now we're going to start talking about, in more and more detail, a person I greatly admire. That's Theodore Roosevelt. At this point in Theodore Roosevelt's career, he is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had been the Civil Service Commissioner under President Arthur. He went on to be the Chief of Police in New York City after that. He was elected to the New York State Assembly at one point, and now he's risen to the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the McKinley administration. Now, what's going to happen here in late February, the Secretary of the Navy, John Long, is going to go on a long weekend getaway because he knows war's brewing after the sinking of the Maine, and it's just inevitable. So he wants to spend a long 4-day weekend with his family. So he's going to put Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, in charge while he's gone. Now, when he leaves, he tells Theodore, because he knows how rambunctious he can be, don't do anything stupid. Just steady the ship. I'll be back in 4 days. You're in charge. Now, as soon as Long leaves and Roosevelt knows he's gone, Roosevelt jumps into action. And that's typical Roosevelt. He will send a wire to Admiral Dewey, who is the commander of the Pacific Fleet. The Pacific Fleet, part of this Great White Fleet of steel battleships, is out on maneuvers in the far Pacific, and he knows that they have arrived in Hong Kong to resupply and give the sailors some liberty, which means give them time off the ship. They've been on the ship for several weeks. He sends a communique to Admiral Dewey telling him war is imminent. So I want you, as soon as you get all your men back on board and you're resupplied, sail to the Philippines. Now, the reason why he directs him to go to the Philippines is a Spanish colony at this point in history. And the Spanish Pacific Fleet is stationed in Manila Bay in the Philippines. So Dewey will do that, and Dewey will do one other thing while he's in Hong Kong. If you look in your textbook on page 627, you can see a photograph of Emilio Aguinaldo. You can see him. He's the young man on horseback. He's the leader of the Filipino rebels who, in similar fashion to Cuba, have been on and off fighting for their independence. He is in exile in Hong Kong, and Dewey knows this. So Dewey has him located and asks him, do you want to accompany me to the Philippines? I've been ordered there for potential conflict. And Aguinaldo is thrilled because he'd love nothing more than see the American Navy blast apart the Spanish Navy. So he jumps on board and joins Dewey in the American fleet. So they will sail from Hong Kong to the Philippines. If you look in your book on page 626, the facing page, you have map 27-2, which shows you Dewey's route to the Philippines. So he will arrive at Manila Bay on May 1st and completely catch the Spanish off guard. Because remember, we didn't even declare war till mid-April. So he'll arrive there, catch the Spanish fleet anchored in Manila Bay, and in one afternoon, the entire 10 ships of the Spanish fleet are sunk by the Americans' Great White Fleet, which are steel battleships. Now you need to remind yourselves, Spain didn't build a steel navy. They have a wooden navy. So when our steel battleships steam into Manila Bay, they fire their 40-inch guns at these wooden ships and blow them up one by one. The Spaniards try to fight back, but they're using old cannon and cannonballs, which just hit the side of these steel battleships and fall harmlessly into the water. So in that afternoon, Spain loses its entire fleet of 10 ships, over 400 sailors are killed, and the United States Navy does not even suffer a single casualty. It's the greatest victory in American naval history. And Admiral Dewey, after the great victory, wires back to the Navy Department, and they obviously wonder if he needs any assistance. Should we dispatch a hospital ship from Pearl Harbor to take care of the wounded? Then he reports there are no wounded, and that the only thing his men really need, in a sarcastic message, is cough drops, because they're all hoarse from cheering so loudly. So, this is our first battle of the Spanish-American War. And just a little side note on Admiral Dewey. Admiral Dewey is the state of Vermont's greatest naval hero. He was born in Montpelier. If you go to Montpelier, his birthplace is a state site. And also there are guns from his fleet that attacked Manila Bay on the front steps of the Capitol of Montpelier. There's paintings of the battle and paintings of Admiral Dewey. He's quite a hero in Vermont. Now, one problem with the Filipino situation, though, since the Navy was just out on naval maneuvers, they didn't have any U.S. Marines on board. And typically, if this would have been a planned attack with more strategy in mind, they would have had Marines with them. The Marines would have then landed in the Philippines and taken the war to the Spanish foot soldiers. They didn't have any Marines. So Marines will have to be sent from the naval station at Pearl Harbor to join Dewey's men, or fleet, excuse me. In the meantime, Dewey sends Emilio Aguinaldo, the rebel, ashore to get his rebels back together and start attacking the Spanish until the Americans arrive. We'll talk about their late arrival shortly. Now, what's going to happen next is the real battles of the war will take place, where most of this war is fought in Cuba. So if you flip the page to 628, we want to talk about the most famous group of the United States Army that fights in this particular war, and that's Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. There's a famous photograph of Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders on the top of page 628. Let me give you a little background information on the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a unit that was raised by Theodore Roosevelt and Colonel Leonard Wood. Now, back in this day and age, similar to the Civil War, individuals could get permission from the War Department to raise their own regiments and train them. So Theodore Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, got a commission to be a colonel in the United States Army, and he and his old college buddy from Harvard, Leonard Wood, who was a career military man, Colonel Leonard Wood, will get together and raise their own regiment, and it'll be a cavalry unit because Theodore Roosevelt's very accomplished on horseback. He owned a ranch out in the Dakotas and so forth. So these two put together their own regiment known as the Rough Riders, and here's how they raise these men. First thing they do is they contact all of their college pals. Theodore Roosevelt, when he went to Harvard, played tennis on the tennis team and also wrestled on the wrestling team. So they got a hold of all their old Ivy League buddies who they had competed with and so forth, and told them they're raising this regiment to go and fight the Spanish. A lot of the Rough Riders are Ivy League graduate friends of Theodore Roosevelt and Leonard Wood. Then Theodore Roosevelt, who had spent some time out in the Dakotas, I'll talk about that later when I talk about his life, made a lot of friends with cowboys. He owned a ranch. So he gets a hold of them, who better to be members of his cavalry unit, but experienced cowboys. They hear the call and join the Rough Riders also. Finally, he doesn't have enough men to fill out the regiment, and he has connections with the New York State Department of Corrections. So he calls the commissioner and asks him if he would be willing to give prisoners with experience on horseback who have committed nonviolent crimes early release from prison to join the Rough Riders. And obviously, when the Commissioner of Corrections agrees, a lot of volunteers are ready to leave prison and join Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. So, what it boils down to, the Rough Riders are Theodore Roosevelt and Leonard Wood, the two commanding colonels, and Ivy League grads, cowboys from the Dakotas, and ex-cons. Quite a crew. But they become a really crack cavalry unit. Roosevelt used some of his personal wealth to make sure everybody is fully equipped. They train and they're ready to go. Now, if you look at this map that's on the same page, 628, Roosevelt and the Rough Riders are going to depart from Tampa Bay, like a lot of troops did. And when they're loading the troops onto the ship, the Rough Riders included, all of a sudden the urgent call comes across on the ship system that Colonel Roosevelt and Colonel Wood need to report to the docks immediately. They do, and they meet the captain of the ship. The captain of the ship has an important message for them, and the message is, unfortunately, we do not have room for your horses on our ship. It's completely filled with men, supplies, ammunition, and so forth. We only have room for 2 horses. So he tells Roosevelt and Wood, pick 2 horses, that's all you can take, and that's the end of it. Roosevelt and Wood obviously are not happy. They're a cavalry unit. But the captain basically tells them, pick 2. That's all you get. So obviously Roosevelt and Wood will pick their horses. They're the commanders. The rest of the horses remain in Tampa Bay. So this is going to make the Rough Riders' feats in battle even more amazing, because they're going to enter into battle as a horseless cavalry unit. Fully trained on horseback, but they're going to have to run instead of ride. And when you see famous paintings of the Rough Riders charging up San Juan Hill or Kettle Hill, you'll always see 2 men on horseback, that's Roosevelt and Wood, and the rest of the Rough Riders running up these hills. So now let's talk about the famous feats of the Rough Riders, and we can see where this all happens on the map on page 628. what's going to happen here in early July in Cuba on the southern shore near Santiago is the Spanish Caribbean fleet is anchored in Santiago Harbor. The American Great White Fleet is waiting for them out in the ocean off the shore. Now, they cannot go in after the Spanish fleet because there's a very narrow passage to this protected harbor, and it's highly armed. So the fleet has to be flushed out of there. That becomes the job of Theodore Roosevelt, Leonard Wood, and the Rough Riders. They're going to make two famous charges on July 1st. They're going to charge up San Juan Hill, capture it, put artillery on top of San Juan Hill, and they're also going to charge up the much more important hill that doesn't get as much press, Kettle Hill, and place artillery on top of it after capturing it also. Now remember, these are very brave men, Ivy League grads, cowboys from the Dakotas, and ex-cons, because they've trained to fight on horseback and now they're on foot. But they still pull off these two amazing victories, get artillery on the top of these two strategic sites, and they will then flush out the Spanish fleet into the Caribbean, where the Great White American Fleet is waiting, and will firmly defeat them in similar fashion to the Spanish Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay. Now, basically, the fighting in Cuba will drag on for about another month, but all of this will come to an end in early August 1898, when the Spanish will surrender to the Americans in Cuba, and the war is over. So essentially, all told, you got about a month and a half of fighting. That's why John Hay labeled it the Splendid Little War. Now, back to the Philippines. Unfortunately, the Marines will arrive there a day late, a day after the Spanish have already surrendered in Cuba. And according to the rules of war, even though the Americans then land the next day and the Spanish surrender to them pretty quickly, that doesn't count because the war has already ended a day or two earlier. So any territorial gains in the Philippines won't count at the negotiation table. So now I want to quickly sum up the casualties in this war to end this particular lecture. All told, another reason why this was considered a splendid little war, the Americans lost 5,400 men, all told, in the Spanish-American War. Out of that number, only 379 of them died from actual combat deaths at the hands of the enemy. The other roughly 5,000 men will die from disease. Yellow fever is a horrible disease, and so is malaria at this point on Cuba. Many will die of heat stroke or heat exhaustion, because many of them have to go to battle in July in Cuba in surplus wool uniforms from the Civil War, because we didn't have enough uniforms. And you can imagine how that would take its toll on a soldier's body. And then a sizable number of men died from the causes known as friendly fire. They were shot by their own men by mistake. Because remember, these guys didn't get proper basic training. They basically played army with wooden guns and really weren't prepared for the battlefield. So, all told, only 379 men actually meet their fate at the hands of the enemy. So, this is an impressive war for the United States. And when we pick back up, I'm going to talk about the treaty that ends it all, the gains of the United States, and the future of Theodore Roosevelt. So I'll be back momentarily with another lecture for you. Thanks for listening to me. Talk to you soon.